My name is Vanesa Castan-Broto. It's actually quite difficult to say, so very well done. And I have to start by saying that to talk about the sheer happiness that I felt the day Luis Gibronet, who is a PhD student working with me, told me about the Energy and Society research group. I couldn't feel happier. And I was actually reflecting after talking with Mike on why I haven't been able to engage more actively with the group as I would have liked. And probably this is the reason. And Mapping Urban Energy Landscapes is a project funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. It's 3 years, and it has really 3 questions. One is, what are urban energy landscapes? The second is, can we find evidence of urban energy landscapes, particularly in cities in the global south? And the third question is, so what? Is this useful for anything? Can we find maybe talk about transition pathways or talk about locking factors that emerge from those urban energy landscapes? And the first year I have dedicated to just think about urban energy landscapes, what they are, how can we define. So if ever you have to give an example of an academic working in an ivory tower, that has been me this year, in which I've been doing a lot of reading and thinking around this concept. But I'd like to start by explaining how I became interested in these energy landscapes, why I was looking for an alternative that would talk to the work I had done so far and that would give me different answers of the answers I had found. And it's very important to explain that I was coming at it, I've been studying first the coal energy in Bosnia, and then I moved into understanding global responses in global cities to climate change, and particularly climate change experiments. And I was coming at it from an urban political ecology perspective, and this is a perspective in which the relationship between society, social transformation, and ecological transformation is crucial, and in which modernity is understood as a conquer, as a drive to tame nature, and with quite high political consequences. And of course, there's this seminal book by Heinen, Swingedo, and Kaika, very inspiring, in which they argue that if you are going to look at them from a political ecology perspective, cities emerge as this kind of group of flows, interwoven flows of materials, information, and different kind of cultural symbols and so on. And that infrastructure is that key matrix that sustains those forms of material and semiotic circulation. And when we did this analysis, particularly trying to understand urban experiments, we got to very interesting conclusions about the politics of climate change, how climate change was used and served to develop new forms of governance in the city, and how different actors were intervening, and particularly actors in spaces where you wouldn't expect them to intervene. And also this question about whether from small changes you could actually activate quite long transformations, but the consequences of those transformations wouldn't be always obvious. And one example, is that the development of sustainable technologies that give more independence to gated communities in a city like Bangalore in India create quite a lot of inequality because they encroach in the collective resources and they reduce the resources available to people who doesn't have access to that technology. This is a question that has been floating in the audience this afternoon. But I also found that there was something missing of this account, and what it was the continuous interaction of these political changes with broader factors, which were often outside the realm of analysis and outside the space of mere flows related to energy. And that's why I got interested in this idea of landscapes and its relationship with temporal changes and spatial changes. So what bothered me really is that ultimately, okay, I don't have a problem with this idea that we live in an energy culture, that we depend so much on energy, that energy has a centrality to our social life. But what annoys me is that there's not a recognition that such society is also a form of many energy cultures. So different ways, not just in the way, in demand and in the way we behave around energy, but also in how energy is managed. So energy systems are thought to be the same all over the world, And however, they are incredibly different even from neighborhood to neighborhood. There were already some scholars who have thought about energy landscapes, and particularly important is the work of Martin Pasqualetti. Martin Pasqualetti, who is in the University of Arizona, he was really moved by the changes in the landscape following the installation of wind energy. And he made some very important analysis which show how opposition to wind energy projects often was not just a question of I don't want this because it's in my backyard, no? Not in my backyard argument, but rather it was a question about that external project felt to be imposed in the lives of people. And he was quite adamant to show that the values that people impose in the landscape were quite important, not just from an aesthetic point of view, but because it meant something to people. And other scholars like Simon Cowell have made similar analysis of the wind energy landscapes in Wales. This is quite compelling, but still doesn't get to that issue of spatial and temporal variability, of broader aspects of involving socio-technical change, which I'm interested in. So what I decided to do was to look at the notion of landscapes as it relates to technology and as it relates to technological change. And the first point of call, and moving beyond supply perspectives. This is actually a photograph I took in the south of China. It's the place where Zhang Yimou creates this, which is a famous film director. I don't know if maybe you know him. And he creates this fantastic spectacle in which the landscape becomes light, and that's where it became my inspiration. So that's why it's there. But in terms of developing the theoretical perspective, the first port of call I found in the notion of technoscapes. And this refers to the work of Arjun Appadurai. And what Arjun Appadurai is preoccupied with, he finds different, not just technoscapes, but also ethnoscapes, ethoscapes, other types of escapes, which represent the way things are flowing around the world, disregarding what we've considered traditionally as the administrative boundaries or other types of boundaries. And in particular, this notion has been taken also by Andrew Barry, who is in geography, and his notion of technological zones, where he argues it's not just to understand how technologies flow across the globe and what kind of processes to make that possible, but also what are the consequences for those spaces through which those technologies flows, which resonates a lot with my own discontent with urban political ecology. It's not just a focus on the flow, but of whatever allows that flow, or that combination. This is, for example, an image, I don't know if it's familiar to any of you, I just got it from Wikipedia, which is a map of the internet in the whole world. And particularly scholars of communications have looked at the network society and Manuel Castell's work. They have a lot of interest on how this is transforming not just society, but also space, for example, creating new megacities and so on. But also there's another story to be told about this, about the kind of relationships with energy, the ubiquity of electricity that make this network possible. That was one of the visions that I took. Another vision is very familiar to Stein. It's a multi-level perspective. There was a time where I never went to a conference where this graph was not shown, so now it's me who shows it. And the reason why I got interested in the work of socio-technical transitions is that from the very beginning, they were very keen in this notion of landscape. Before the multi-level perspective came to light and became so popular, the historian Thomas Hughes had already defined landscape as that part of the large technological system over which the actors don't have agency. So it's that kind of thing that we cannot manipulate. And it's true that landscape has been always overlooked. So in this perspective, the multi-level perspective focuses on the regime, which is the compendium of norms and also material elements that work around a particular technology. And that regime is situated in a landscape. And there are also niche innovations that from time to time erupt in the regime and cause change. When people test this kind of analysis, as I say, they overlook the landscape. For example, when the scholars, Tim Foxon and his colleagues, studied the energy transition in Britain, and they just described the landscape in a paragraph as the different cultures of energy in Britain and whether people had opinions in the newspapers and so on. And there's so much more to it. So Hills, who has been mentioned already before, he's talked about that landscape as not as a biotope, but as a technotope. And I think that already opens spaces to think more deeply about what it means, this landscape, for the regime. And furthermore, the other thing I would like to add in this regard is that for other thinkers, this landscape is related to the politics of technological change. So I also think it's quite an important thing. And the third current of thinking on landscapes that I look at is that to consider landscapes as assemblages of artifacts, where technology becomes an artifact, an element for social and human manipulation. And of course, this relates very closely with an anthropologist's work, Tim Ingold, who talks about landscapes of dwelling and thinks about the space being made by building and constructing and manipulating through the establishment of those artifacts. So when you look at the different artifacts that create the landscape, they become something else that just the use that they have or the function that they have, as Stein was saying. But they become also part of the daily interaction, that daily set of practices that we have. So those things, flows, regimes, artifacts, the three, they help us to think what landscape is. But landscape is neither of the three. Landscape is what enables them. It's perhaps the connective tissue. It's that space where flows happens. It's that technotope that enables regimes to consolidate and emerge. And it's that kind of context for those artifacts, those backward and forward linkages, the different uses and different views that we have in the artifacts. So that's why I think this idea of energy landscapes, particularly in cities, kind of help us to think about cultural production, about the encoding of norms and conventions, the tacit knowledge, and particularly the backward and forward linkages that explain the particular material and social relations in a particular location. So since I don't have a lot of time, I was just going to give you an example, but I think probably I just wrapped it up there. Thank you.
Any questions from the floor? I just want to ask you, Vanesa, after you construct this theoretical framework, I'm really interested, you're drawing on Castell's work, you're drawing on the couple of people's work that I'm familiar with, and when I was doing network theories. And how are you going to advance into the methodology of collecting? Are you going to do archiving, or are you going to
That's what I'm developing now, the methodology. I would just say I don't really draw on Castells, but I do take it as a point of reference because he does talk about the network society. Right. But I think Apadurai's idea of technoscapes is a bit closer to what I mean.
So, but how do connective tissue differ from the network theory?
Yeah, because I don't plan to look at the flow, but actually at what enables that flow. But what I'm planning to do in my methodology is something which I call follow the energy.
Yeah, follow the energy.
Which is moving through the city and kind of establishing the spaces of those flows. And particularly whenever there are, I'm planning to do that collectively with communities, kind of using well-known techniques of community mapping and so on.
Yeah.
But also thinking about something is called a walk shop, which is different from a workshop in that you walk rather than sit in a chair. And also I'm planning to try to find objects that have a particular meaning and through which we can establish those forward and backward linkages. So where did that object come from? What was it made from? Who brought it there? What kind of regulations? What kind of decisions? but also what kind of materials,
Yes.
and where did those materials come, and how is it used today? How is it maintained, by whom, for what?
That's interesting. It's going to be the scale, how big scale?
Yeah, so I'm doing 4 case studies in 4 different cities, and probably at the neighborhood level, so quite small scale.
Charlotte?
I just had a question about how you were picking your energy. Like, do you make a difference between electricity, between heating, between lighting? Because all these things have different materialities and they require very different connective tissues to create the kind of flow. So I was just wondering what you were doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the questions I've been debating with myself has been whether to focus on electricity only. But I don't think I will do that. Like, my first case study is Maputo in Mozambique, and I think there's a place where heating has a lot of importance and where electricity may have less importance than in our common lives here in London or something. So I'm looking at those 4 systems, which would be energy for heating, electricity, power and transport, which is like a common division in transitions theory. But I'm thinking about whether those categories really fit the special context of the case studies. So I mean, I just take them as a departing point, but I'm open to redefine them. Thank you.